Good.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming to this evening's session of the Social Science Department's Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference, especially on an attractive Michigan spring evening such as this. It's a great pleasure to have all of you here. My name is Bob Hendershot, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce one of our keynote speakers at this year's conference, Dr. Karen Devine. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of detail on the speaker you're about to hear. So. Just by way of introduction, I wanted to mention that she holds a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and Spanish from University College Dublin. She has a Master of Arts in European Integration from the University of Limerick. She has a postgraduate diploma in Statistics from the University of Dublin Trinity College. And of course, she also has a Ph.D. in Political Science from the University of Dublin Trinity College. And she's currently a lecturer in international relations at Dublin City University. And she specializes in teaching European Union politics, Irish foreign policy, international relations theory and methodology. She also teaches on European integration, and she has published quite widely and has many articles and forthcoming articles in journals such as Conflict and Cooperation, International Politics, the International Political Science Review, Irish Political Studies, and International Affairs. Her research interests are quite broad, and she's interested in the politics of neutrality and active neutrality as they affect Ireland and Austria and Sweden and Finland and the European Union in general. She also looks in detail at how foreign policy influences, or how foreign policy is influenced by public opinion in both Europe and here in our country. And she looks at the evolution of the European Union's common security and defense policy as well. She's a regular featured analyst in many newspapers and television shows and radio programs, and is a widely regarded analyst in many professional circles. And I also wanted to mention that she has, over the years, been a great friend of the Grand Rapids Community College Irish Foreign Studies program. And for many years, even before I was involved, and Roger Slosher was the director. He's here tonight. Karen was a regular lecturer for our students when they were in Dublin. And she would always give wonderful lectures and blow our students' minds with heavy-hitting poli-sci analysis about Ireland and Ireland's place in the world. And that's how I got to know Karen. And it's been great to work with her in that context. But it's also the second time she's been able to attend our campus and present to our students here in Grand Rapids. She was here a few years ago for our second Peace Studies Conference. And so it's very good to have her back again. This year she's in America for the whole year because she won a Fullbright grant that has taken her, and now she's doing research based at Columbia University in New York. So it wasn't quite as long a trip this time as the last one. But anyway, it is a great pleasure for all of us to have her here tonight. She's going to talk to us about the role of patriotism and how that sculpts a nation's foreign policy or not. And please help me welcome Dr. Karen Devine.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, if only half of it was true. My name is Karen Devine. I'm from Dublin City University, and I want to thank very much Bob and Susan and all of the team at Grand Rapids for the very kind invitation to come and present here. I absolutely love coming to Grand Rapids, so I never say no to a good Michigan invitation, and I'm delighted to be here. I also want to thank my own university, Dublin City University, for allowing me my one-year sabbatical to come here to the US, and also the Fullbright Commission of Ireland, who gave me the grant to come here for the year. So I just wanted to ask actually a little bit about yourselves, like how many of you are students, maybe if you put your hands up. Good few, most of you, okay, great. Anyone just drop by randomly, not connected to the university? Yeah, great. Any professors here? That I have to watch myself? Okay, Bob, Susan, I think I'm good. That's great. Okay, so one last question. How many of you are very familiar with doing regression analysis, quantitative methods? Hands up, anyone? Okay, so maybe a little bit. Okay, well then what I'm going to do is not worry too much about the numbers and concentrate on what the numbers are telling us in terms of the story. So there's a couple of stories going on here that speak to the themes of this conference, which is identity and race. And what I want to look at is public attitudes to foreign policy. I'm going to mainly concentrate on the US, if that's okay with you, and I'll talk about Ireland to the extent you want me to. But I think things get interesting when you really start digging into the US case. Okay, so what am I going to look at? Well, the US and Ireland and public opinion on foreign policy. A little bit of background on patriotism and identity. I mean, why on earth would you want to look at identity as a driver of public opinion on foreign policy? Certainly in international relations, this is a rather baffling idea, because really, what has identity got to do with foreign policy? It's about military capabilities, it's about strategic relationships, it's about balance of power, it's about all of these realist concepts that we talk about. And this identity stuff is really very fluffy and very hard to pin down, and really doesn't matter. So we'll look at the literatures. I won't go into this too much, between political science and international relations, and what they've had to say so far about patriotism. And within that, core values hypothesis, because identity in a way is about, or at least who you are is about what you stand for. And what you stand for is related to your values. So knowing your values means you know who you are, which informs your identity. And we'll see how that plays out. Constructivism is an international relations theory. I've talked about this before when I was here at the Peace Studies Conference. And that does talk about identity in international relations. And so I needed to marry these two literatures together. The political science literature that looked at public opinion on foreign policy, but didn't look at identity. And then constructivism, which looked at foreign policy in terms of international relations at the state level and did talk about identity. So I needed to pull identity from the state level of constructivism down to the level of the individual and put it into political science. So I'm going to run through a few hypotheses, and this is the data that I have. So I'm looking at the US and Ireland. So in terms of the US, this is an online survey that was conducted at the beginning of 2011. I also want to thank Bill Chittick, who headed up a group that applied to the International Studies Association conference for a venture grant that paid for this survey to be done. So it's a YouGov polymetric survey. And the Irish data that I'm looking at, I used for my PhD thesis as well. And that was, that survey was conducted in the early 2000s. Both are broadly representative samples. I don't need to go into the fact that they're not pure random samples, but we treat them as such when we analyze the data. So I have three different scenarios for each case. So I have three different scenarios for the US foreign policy that people are asked about, and I have three different scenarios for what Irish people were asked about. And we call them the dependent variables, what we're trying to explain, foreign policy outcomes. And then I have a range of independent variables. So I'm arguing that identity and values have some impact on what people's attitudes to foreign policy are. And I'm basically arguing that patriotism, or how proud you are, how proud you feel to be an American, impacts on whether you will use force or not. And the same in Ireland. How proud you are to be Irish will impact on your attitude to Irish foreign policy and whether you want to use force. And that's what we're going to get into. So I have identity, domestic and foreign policy, attitudes, values, and socio-demographics. So we need to take into account, or control for, as we say, age, gender, in the case of the US data, race, income, education, because these things might matter. So we have to control for them and put them in the models as well. And so there's some implications arising from this, and I do want to stress this is a work in progress. And if we have time, we could further explore some of the implications of race that have come out of this research. And I'm really interested to know what you are thinking about this, because you are in fact my target audience, not just for this presentation, but the subject matter that I'm interested in studying, because you all, I'm sure, have opinions on US foreign policy. So it would be interesting to see what you think as we go along. Okay, so as I said, I wanted to bring together these two political science and international relations literatures. I'm not going to talk about it too much. I already really did talk about it. The history of this is that generally in political science, up until the 1990s, it was argued for the previous 40 years that public opinion on foreign policy is not rational. It's not structured. So there's no values underlying it. So it means that attitudes oscillate, they change. And so therefore, the public opinion is irrational. And of course, if you're irrational, then as a policymaker, you can dismiss it. And you don't need to take it into account. So you start getting into normative issues about democracy and whether our leaders in Ireland and the US need to take into account public opinion. Because the leader will go, well, you know, they're going to change their mind tomorrow. The opinion is rational. It's not constant over time. There's no way to predict any attitudes because they're not based on values. In the 1990s, this thesis was reversed. And we started to look at data a little bit more critically and maybe a little bit better. And we saw that there was, in fact, an underlying structure of values which you could predict attitudes from. Okay, so that's more or less what the political science literature has been saying. And then constructivism, as I said, was really looking at international relations as interest-based. You know, what do I want to get out of a particular situation if I'm the US or if I'm Ireland? It's about interest. It's not really about identity until Alexander Wendt, quite a famous international relations scholar, started looking at identity quite seriously. And it now has currency. But public opinion analysis has a little bit to catch up in that respect. So anyway, I'm going to give the background to the hypothesis. So I did my PhD on public opinion and Irish neutrality, and I found that patriotism mattered. In fact, it was the second biggest predictor of your attitude to neutrality. What I found was the prouder you were to be Irish, the more likely you were to support Irish neutrality. And Irish neutrality means independence in foreign policy decision-making. It means not getting involved in wars. It means being impartial. And it also sort of has a range of secondary values like non-aggression, like supporting developing countries, standing up to big powers at the UN, trying to be an honest broker. So I found, as I said, patriotism and also independence would predict an attitude to neutrality. So if you wanted Ireland to maintain independence in terms of decision-making, you were more likely to be supportive of Irish neutrality. What about the US? Hands up here, how many of you think that identity or how proud you are to be American matters? Quite a few of you. Okay, so why? Why does it matter? I'll start with you at the top. Why do you think it matters?
I think because we're proud of our country and we think that we have better systems, and so we try to give other countries the same pride.
Okay, so you're proud of your country, you think you've better systems, and other countries can sort of learn from that, and you want to be able to give them that kind of level of ability. Yeah, great. Any other? Why else would it matter? How about yourself? Yeah.
Because in America, like, we have our own individual rights and freedoms and more than other countries, and so how that
Okay.
we're able to make our own decisions. And
Great. So you have more rights, more freedoms, and this is part of what it is to be American. This is part of America, and this is what makes you proud of being American. You have rights and freedoms, exactly, which other countries don't enjoy. Another good thing. Okay, anyone else? What about yourself? Sorry, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that it's also based on values, and that's one of the challenges is the values are changing so much.
Okay, like values, for example. Does anything pop into your head in terms of values?
States' rights is utmost important.
Liberty. state rights. So you mean sort of non-federal level of governance, the ability to have, okay, so don't have Washington telling us what to do, that we can run ourselves within the state. We make policy at the state level. Yes, great, okay. So it's the quality of the American political system and of democracy as well. And in the European Union context, we call that subsidiarity, or trying to take decisions at the lowest level possible, as close as possible to the people that those decisions affect, as close as possible to us, in other words. Okay, great. Any other sort of ideas why patriotism might matter? How proud you feel to be American? I just want to check. If you have a score of 1 to 7, where 1 is the most proud, and 7 is not at all proud, how many of you would be a 1, like the proudest? No. Hands up. How many on a scale of 1 to 7? And I'm doing this counterintuitively. In other words, so the lowest score means you are the proudest. So, and I'll tell you why, because that's implicated with the research. So anyone who would be a number 1 on a scale of 1 to 7 of being very proud of being American? Okay, what about 6? Or sorry, what about 2? A few 2s. Okay, and 3? Yes. So you're all more or less agreeing that you're proud. What about the middle, 4? So in between. And why would that be? Do you mind me asking?
Well, for me, like I'm proud of like what America is founded on, the foundations, you know, the ideals that our founding fathers made and founded this country on. However, the history of America is bloody, and that is what I'm not proud of.
Okay, so you're proud of the founding ideals of the state, but the history has been bloody, and that's not something to be proud of. Anything in particular you're thinking of?
Particularly the abuse of Indians, for example.
Native Americans, the abuse of Native Americans. So moving them off their own territories, sort of, you know, putting their children into sort of regular schools, getting them to change their appearance, that sort of thing.
And not including, you know, the African American, the dark history with that, you know, slavery and the civil rights movement.
Okay, slavery, African Americans, the civil rights movement. Great, okay. So basically, I might as well stop now, because this is exactly what this research is about. And we're going to see how Native Americans and African Americans, blacks, feel very differently about patriotism and have different attitudes compared to whites. And that's where the race dimension comes in. It's interesting. Okay, thank you for that. All right, so we know that patriotism matters. Well, what has the literature said? Here's what it has said. There's 2 authors in particular. These are lead authors. Et al. Means with others. So Hurwitz and others in 1993 said identity matters. They said individuals have very strong affective ties to their nation, so feelings of affection are more likely to express anti-communist views and hardline military beliefs, presumably because of the patriot's twin convictions of the superiority of his or her system of government, and that's come up, and the need to militantly defend it. Okay, so our system is better, and we have to make sure that we can maintain it. So that's one part of the literature. The second author, a little bit more recent, Richard Herman, he said national attachment is related to militarist dispositions until chauvinism is controlled for. So what he calls chauvinism, it's a kind of an unconditional support. So the motto would be my country, right or wrong. And I'd call this ethnocentrism. And he said, once you put in this notion of my country, right or wrong, or I am a superior as an American to others, then in fact, patriotism no longer predicts the use of force, but in fact, it predicts diplomacy. And what's actually driving use of force is this notion of superiority to others. Okay? So that's what the literature said. So we'll see what happens in terms of the data that I have and the models that I've run. So what I'm trying to do is come up with some theory, some ideas of the conditions and the reasons why identity matters in attitudes to foreign policy. And I'm trying to compare large with small states, because I found patriotism mattered a lot in Ireland, but it predicted attitudes that were not in favor of using force. Whereas in America, a much bigger country, patriotism also matters equally, but that actually predicts an attitude in relation to the use of force. Certainly it did in Hurwitz's study in '93, and it did for a little bit in Herman's study in 2009, until he controlled for or put into the model ethnocentrism, a belief that you're superior to others. Okay, so we need to understand this across states. And then I wanted to look at the impact of aspects of the interaction between domestic policy and foreign policy. So like you were saying, at the federal or at the non-federal level, at the state level, you need to be able to control your own policies, whether it's in relation to reproductive rights, all of those sort of moral issues, and so forth, even if it's related to budgetary issues. So domestic policy and those values do impact, it's argued, on foreign policy dispositions. So I have to control for them. So they're in the model as well. Okay. So there's a lot of literature, at least there's a bit of literature on identity and foreign policy. So Rick Herman's study in 2009, my own one in 2008, earlier ones in 2001 and in the 90s. So we're arguing, as I said, identity is linked to values. You know who you are by what you stand for. Okay, that's more or less what that's saying. And there's example of this at the state level. So the Irish White Paper on Foreign Policy, which was published in 1996, hasn't been followed up with since. But in that foreign policy, right at the start, and indeed later on, it said, Irish foreign policy is a statement of the kind of people we are. So in a way, American foreign policy is also a statement of the kind of people who Americans are. Irish neutrality, as understood by Irish people, is a reflection of their values. And it's kind of a projection of our national identity in international affairs. You know, we don't want to invade anyone. We kind of want to be left alone just to try and get along ourselves. And you can see that Irish people and the quite intense level of pride, of national identity, of being proud of being Irish, that is very stable over time. Over 30 years, that has been very stable, even compared to other European countries. So the Greeks and the Irish are the most proud within the European Union. Does anyone want to speculate which countries perhaps would be on the other end, the bottom end of that scale, who maybe aren't as proud of their national identity? The British? Yeah, they're in the middle, yeah? Germany, yeah, classic, Germany. A lot less in terms of national pride. And again, that's probably linked to history and to culture. Okay, so Rick Herman in 2009, he had a different type of patriotism than the patriotism that I'm using in my models. Whereas Hurwitz in '93, he had it, and I have it highlighted in bold. He said it's an effective bond for one's nation which engenders pride and support. Okay, so support will start to matter once we get into scenarios where the US is threatened. So what do you want to do? Do you want to use diplomacy or force? And the question he used was similar to what I have. I have a 7-point scale, and he has a 4-point scale. So extremely proud, very proud, somewhat proud, and not very proud. So we're quite comparable. And the US question that I'm using is, I'm proud to be an American. 1 is strongly agree, and 7 is strongly disagree. So in other words, the lower your score, the more patriotic you are. The higher your score, the less patriotic you are. I'll make sure that we remind ourselves of that as we go along. So in the Irish data, I also had a similar question about being proud to be Irish, but I couldn't use it in this model. For various reasons to do it, some questions were asked. There was a sort of a survey was split in half, and there was some domestic policy aspects that were asked, and they weren't asked on the same part of the survey that had the proud question. So I had to substitute the importance question. So how important is it to you that you're Irish? But it's touching on the same kind of identity questions. So this is basically my list of variables, and you can see there's quite a few. Right at the top is patriotism. And what I did was I wanted to make sure I was trying to get as close as a comparison as possible between the questions that Irish people were asked and the questions that US people were asked. So we'll start at the top. I'm proud to be an American. And the Irish one, as I said, unfortunately, I just had to use how important is it to you. Interests. The United States should always do what is in our own interests, even if our allies object. Versus the Irish one, Ireland should always follow its own interests, even if it leads to conflict with other nations. So we call that interest. Ethnocentrism is that motto, my country, right or wrong, in the US survey. And then in the Irish survey, people were asked, to the extent that they agreed or disagreed with the statement, Irish people should support their country even when it's wrong. So the wording is slightly different, but the meaning is more or less there. Independence, in the US case, is about the other, expanding the power of the UN, even if it lessens the influence of the United States, or reduce the power of the UN so that the US can be more influential. In the Irish case, the other is the European Union. So it's about, do we want to give more of our power to the EU, or do we want to retain Irish independence? So it's a different other. Isolationism. The US should mind its own business internationally, not get involved in other people's affairs. In the Irish case, it's again the European Union other. So it's about European unification, it's just gone too far. Or other people would say it hasn't gone far enough. What about welfare? So we're getting into our domestic policy. Should we spend more or less money on welfare? In both the US and the Irish cases, similar questions. Then there's another domestic policy thing. It's about sort of the question about protecting the environment, even if it hurts the economy, or should we, let the economy grow, don't worry about the environment. Similar questions on the Irish side. There should be more economic growth and jobs, even if it means damage to the environment. So, do you get my drift? Similar enough questions. Business regulation. Whether government regulations hurt business and they're unfair, in the US case, or whether they protect society. And then in the Irish case, business should be entirely free from state control, to business should be strictly controlled by the state. Next ones, fairness. It's okay if some groups have more of a chance in life than others. So this is where race might start mattering. In the Irish case, as long as there's equal opportunity for all, it's fair if some people have more money or wealth than others. Obedience. Now, I put this in because it's to do with authoritarianism. Didn't tend to matter in the model. So obedience and respect for authority is very important, that children should learn. I didn't have a direct question, again, because of the nature of the Irish survey. Some questions were asked, others were not, depending on the sample. So I have one about, all in all, family life suffers when the woman has a full-time job, because it's sort of the obedience is linked to status of women. Gender, of course, if you're male or female, tends to matter. Females are considered to be doves, and men tend to be more hawkish. So men are more willing to use force. Women are traditionally less in favor of using force, so we have to control for that. Age, when you were born, what age you are now at the time of the survey. Race, I don't have anything equivalent in Ireland because it's quite racially homogenous. There are some minorities, but race isn't a variable in the Irish model. Education, from no high school to being a high school graduate, some college, a 4-year degree to a postgrad in the US case, and then the Irish case, there's 1 to 11 scale, so there's plenty of variation there, and then income. So we're trying to control for everything here. So it's a big enough model. So here's our dependent variables, and these are the 3 scenarios that I talked about. They're interesting. In the first case for the US, it's a general question. Do you think the US should solve problems through diplomacy and international pressure, or do you think the US should be ready to use force, military force? So, we'll talk about the question wording as we go along. The next one, troops. So there's a situation where North Korea has invaded South Korea. South Korea is considered an ally of the US. And the president has made a decision to send troops. Do you support that decision or not? The third scenario, North Korea has torpedoed a US military, a naval warship. Half of that sample, that's the scenario they were given. The other half of the sample, So there's 1,200 people. 600 people were given this question. North Korea has torpedoed a US naval warship. You know, do you want to use force or diplomacy? The other half, the other 600 were told the North Korea has torpedoed a US naval warship, killing all on board. Okay, yes?
I would definitely question it. It's subject to false flags attacks, and it's brought us into multiple wars and it's a fact. So I just wanted to bring that in.
Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, in Vietnam, I can't remember the name of the bay, but there was a boat that was, before we invaded Cambodia, I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah.
But I know that it was proved that it was a false flag attack. And,
Okay, so you're talking about real situations, yeah. And what this survey is doing is more or less putting to people a scenario if this happened. So we're not saying it's definitely happened, but you're right, there are cases where these have happened in real life. So we're trying to touch on these issues that have come up before. Exactly, okay. So again, we have our scales, 1 to 7 on most of them. So on the Irish side, they're asked about whether you want to retain neutrality or not. Whether Ireland should do all it can to unite fully with the European Union or should it retain its independence. So that's a foreign policy scenario. And then the final one is about Northern Ireland. And it's a question as to whether Northern Ireland is considered a domestic policy issue or a foreign policy issue. Because Northern Ireland is a separate state from Ireland. So ergo, it should be foreign. And we'll see whether it is or not. So the scenarios are, it's essential that Ireland becomes united in one state, and the other one is the different parts of Ireland are best left as separate states. Okay, and I think it was in 1998 we had a referendum on the Belfast Agreement, and we also changed Articles 2 and 3 of our Constitution. We did in our Constitution have a claim to the 6 counties in the northeast of Ireland, and we revoked that claim. Okay, so that's going to be touched on. Okay, so I just wanted to just give you a flavor, and these are just, you know, we're not getting into regression at this stage, but this is just to look at how proud you are to be American by race, because this conference is about race and identity. So as I said, remember, the smaller the number, the more patriotic or the prouder you are to be American. So we can see right at the top, the smallest number here is for whites at 1.64. And the majority of people in the sample, 858, are white, or define themselves ethnically as white. Next is Native American, but there's very, very small numbers of people. There's only 10 people in the sample. So there isn't enough of them to be able to be sure that this is definitely statistically significant. In other words, this difference is real. You could ask another 10 Native Americans, and they might give you a slightly different score. So we would have needed more to be sure of this. But it's a good illustration. Next is Hispanic at 2, and very close behind them, if you identify yourself as black, 2, mixed a little bit less, and then Asian. So the average is 1.75. So generally speaking, Americans are very patriotic. They're very proud to be American. Okay, so on a 1 to 7 scale, they're averaging between 1 and 2. Let's have a look at this in terms of education, because education is supposed to matter as well. And we can see here that there's a pattern in that the more education you have, the slightly less patriotic you are. So again, the smaller the number, the more patriotic. So 1.6 if you left school at high school and didn't continue on education and started working then. If you went on and did 2 years of college, 1.7, no high school. There's a very small sample. There's 49 people in that category. 4 years, some college through to postgraduate. So you can see the difference between, say, high school of a mean of 1.6 and postgraduate a mean of 1.9. So there's a 0.3 difference there. And again, the average is 1.75. Okay, so these are the two groups. You can see that you know, there's sort of 60s and 70s, 1.6 to 1.7, and then you start getting into 1.8, close to 1.9 when you look at the postgraduate. So education seems to have a relationship with patriotism, but those differences aren't really big, you know, 1.6 versus 1.9. They're not big. What about by age? So I'll go back, actually. I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think? Do you think the older you are, the more patriotic you are, or the younger you are, the more patriotic you are? How many people, hands up, think the older you are, the more patriotic you are? Okay, quite a few. Nearly a majority. How many who think the younger you are, the more patriotic you are? There's a few hands. And how many don't know, aren't sure? Most people have given an opinion. Okay, so as it turns out, again, the lower the score, it's the older you are, the more patriotic you are, rather than the younger you are. So you're right. So as you, in terms of this age profile, when you're getting into your 60s, 70s, 80s, the oldest person in the sample was 90, the lower your score, the more patriotic you are, the prouder you are to be American, compared to the youngers. So the younger ones are closer to 3, and the older are closer to 1. And you can see there's there's a linear relationship there. Is that okay? Clear enough? Yeah? Okay. Now, we're going to get into the models. So here's the first one. Some people believe the US should solve international problems by using diplomacy and other forms of international pressure, like sanctions, for example, and use military force only if it's absolutely necessary. So the focus here is on last resort. Suppose we put those people at 1 on this scale. Others believe diplomacy and pressure often fail and the US has to be ready to use military force. So we put them at 7 on this scale. So where would you put yourself on a scale of 1 to 7? So look at this question wording. It's worth just breaking it down, just to understand it a little bit. So the notion of should is sort of normative. So it's hypothetical. We're not talking about a specific scenario where, you know, a naval warship, say, for example, has been attacked. So how should the US solve international problems? It touches on the use of force, and I would expect values to be important. Identity is potentially important if it's linked to values, but it doesn't sort of strike at the heart of being an American. It's kind of about the US and how it should solve problems. So use of force only if absolutely necessary. In relation to the Herman literature in 2009, he said that you would expect ethnocentrism to matter because it's related to the willingness of a readiness to use force. He argues that if you are confident, you are willing to fight, you're willing to compete, and to some degree it's related to imperialism. So use force only if necessary doesn't really correlate with that. It's more like more of a sort of a less forceful, more neutral stance. And the US, okay, so when we say the United States, the actual state or its identity isn't threatened, but there's a potential that it's indirectly going to matter through values. And domestic policy values could come into play here. But I'm arguing identity probably won't matter too much here. So my hypothesis, because we always have to come up with hypothesis, the null hypothesis means there's really nothing going on, that patriotism doesn't matter. And I'm arguing that really foreign and domestic policy values will matter before identity will. And we'll see what happens. So this is the model. So I won't go, as I said, too much into the numbers. I'm just going to tell the story. The coefficients here, the minuses tell you and the pluses tell you the direction of where you're going in terms of the question. So 1 is towards diplomacy. So if it's minus, you're going more towards diplomacy. And if it's plus, force is at 7, you're going more towards force. So we'll have a look at these. I've kind of separated them out. So patriotism at the top is the identity variable I'm interested in. So the next section down here is interest, ethnocentrism, independence, isolationism. They're more foreign policy values. The next section is about welfare, environment versus economy, business regulation, fairness, whether groups are, you know, it's okay for them to get ahead or not, and obedience. So they're more sort of domestic values, perhaps. age and gender, race, education and income, they're your socio-demographics. So you can see them grouped there. So in terms of this, what matters? Actually, independence comes out as mattering the most. So patriotism does not matter in the model. So independence is related to the support of the use of force, the readiness to use force. So what we're saying here is the more influence you seek for America, the more ready you are to use force. And this is in the context of the UN. So you're saying reduce the power of the UN so the US can have more influence. And that is related to an attitude that says the US should be ready to use force if diplomacy fails. And it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You know, you don't want the UN telling you what to do. And this kind of makes sense. So the next ones that matter are interests, ethnocentrism, and business. So ethnocentrism, this idea, my country, right or wrong, you know, a total commitment. This predicts a shift in favor of the US using diplomacy to solve problems if you disagree with the statement. So if you turn it around, it means the more you agree with my country, right or wrong, the more likely you are to use force. So it's a little bit perhaps authoritarian, a little bit ethnocentric, and related to the use of force. Interests. So again, we're getting quite realist here. It doesn't matter about identity. It's about who gets what, when, and how. Interests. So that also predicts support for the use of force. A 1-year increase in disagreeing with the statement that the US should always do what's in its own interest, even if our allies object, predicts a shift towards US using diplomacy to solve problems. And so the inverse of that is the more you are willing to pursue interests, regardless of objections from allies, the more ready you are to use force. So you can see how these values are beginning to cohere. So finally, interestingly, government regulation of business. So for a unit increase towards the belief that government regulations hurt business, you're going to move towards a readiness to use force. So it is about having the power to do what you want to do on your own terms. Okay, others that matter in yellow here, isolationism, welfare, and fairness. And anti-isolationism, so in other words, believing that you should get involved in other people's business is related to the use of force, and decreasing welfare spending. If you think the government is spending too much on welfare, that's also related to a willingness to use force, a need for the US to be ready to use force. What about diplomacy then? Who's going the other way? Well, fairness. So if you disagree that it's okay for some groups having more of a chance in life, then you are more likely to say that the US should really be more diplomatic in terms of how it approaches solving international problems. And maybe you're thinking in your minds, this is sort of mapping onto sort of Republican democratic ideology through to Tea Party independence. They all seem to cohere around that. Native American, so race is actually mattering in this model. So I'm going to explain how race works. Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native, mixed, and other. What we have to do, because these are basically names, these are nominal categories, and you can't measure them by a number, okay? So what we do is we use a reference category, which was white. So how you interpret these coefficients means how your attitude compares as a Native American versus being a white person, okay? So the Native Americans in this case are actually more prone to using force than white people. And it's statistically significant. But again, as I said, there's only 10 people who identify themselves as Native American in the sample. So we can't get too excited about this being a very important difference. And education also mattered. But I'll come to that. Okay. So in terms of our null hypothesis, how has it turned out? Have values mattered before patriotism? And it turns out that they have. And the most important value is independence, what I call independence anyway, reducing the power of the UN in favor of US influence. And that will predict a readiness to use force. Patriotism doesn't matter. So identity doesn't matter here. Okay, what about the second model? Do you support or oppose the president's decision to send troops to defend our ally South Korea? Because North Korea has invaded South Korea. This is a scenario. We're not saying it's definitely happened, but it's a scenario. So let's look at the question wording again very quickly. President's decision, to some degree, you're not really talking about foreign policy. Maybe you're talking about supporting the president as the leader of your country. So, you know, we have to sort of bear that in mind, how people interpret these questions that are being asked. LES has said routinely patriotism has been conceptualized not as support for the nation's ideals, which is what we had talked about in terms of our system and so forth, but rather loyalty to official policies. So perhaps that touches on that. Our ally, that signals an identification with an in-group. South Korea is our friend. And if you believe part of your values as being an American is that you help out your friends, then this is going to start to matter if that's your concept of patriotism. If you're proud of being American, and being American means helping your allies. So if patriotism means that, it should emerge as a predictor of support. LES has said in America's 230 years, the US military has intervened in other nations an average of once a year. So compare that to Ireland, who has never intervened in another country, and yet patriotism also matters. I would expect that isolationism, so the US should mind its own business and let other countries get along the best that they can on their own. That should have something to do with this scenario. Because really, what are the US interests in this? There doesn't seem to be, I mean, the US itself hasn't been attacked, an ally has been invaded, you know, the president is going to send troops. So if you think that really the US should get active and involved in other countries' business, that's probably going to matter. More than any other values, you would think. So the null hypothesis is patriotism doesn't matter unless your concept of patriotism involves being a good friend, okay? And perhaps getting involved in other countries. So we call this, if it's linked to action to send troops, military patriotism. So if there are enough people in this sample of US public opinion that have that concept, that have that value in being American, it's going to matter. If there isn't, it's probably not going to matter. We're not going to see it coming out in this model. Okay, so here's the model. Again, we have our list of coefficients. I don't need to go into these too much. I'm just going to tell the story. Again, we can divide them out between identity, domestic policy, foreign policy, values, and our socio-demographics. So it turns out that isolationism, or a willingness to get involved, a belief that you should get involved in other countries' business, is the key predictor. And it's a predictor for supporting troops. So the more you would sort of disagree with the idea that the US should just stay out of everybody else's business, the less likely you are to support the president's decision to send troops. The more that you want to intervene, you think the US should intervene, you're going to support the president's decision. So the more you seek America to get involved in other people's businesses, the more you're going to support sending troops. Gender matters next. So remember I said earlier that there's they call it the gender gap hypothesis, that women are supposed to be less in favor of using force, and it is the case here. Being female rather than male will predict a shift in attitude towards opposing the president's decision to send troops. Fairness is next, again, so we can see domestic policy, the value of egalitarianism is starting to matter here. If you disagree with the statement that it's okay that some groups in life have more of a chance than others, then you're going to be opposed to the decision to send troops. So if you want equality at home, you are not going to send troops abroad. Next is education does matter, independence matters, fairness. So I've talked about that. Sorry, patriotism, yeah, here it is. It's starting to matter. So it's at the top there. It's in a broken blue line. So it's actually the least important of all of the important factors. But it does matter a little bit. So maybe there is something going on in terms of patriotism, meaning we are good allies and we help those who are our allies. Again, the less patriotic you are, the more you're going to oppose the decision to send troops. So being more patriotic is associated with troops being sent. So you can see that we're starting to see a bit of a relationship with the use of force and how proud you are to be American. The prouder you are, the more likely you are to agree with the president's decision to send troops. But are you being patriotic in terms of supporting your president, or are you being patriotic in terms of wanting to use force? That's the question. And we're going to find out the answer to that when we look at our third model, which does involve a direct attack on a US, an element of the US military. Okay, so in terms of our second model, does patriotism matter? I said that it probably doesn't unless certain conditions are met, unless there's an element of military patriotism. And really, it doesn't matter so much, and it's your attitude as to whether you should get involved in other people's business, which is the main predictor here. But it matters a little bit. So we're seeing that it has a weak relationship to sending troops in this case. Okay, any questions so far? Any comments? No? Okay, how am I doing for time? Okay, so third model then. So this is where it gets interesting. Again, it's a hypothetical scenario. Would you support or oppose the use of military force by the US in response to the following situation? A North Korean submarine sinks a US Navy warship, and as I said, half the sample were also exposed to the second part of that, which is killing all on board. Okay, so the US military has been attacked. So do you strongly oppose the use of military force in this situation, or do you strongly support it? So this is a potential foreign policy crisis. It's a definite threat. So the question should tap into threat perception. It should trigger military patriotism if it exists. And killing all on board, actually the addition of that didn't change the attitude very much. So what I did was I collapsed both of those samples together into one group to analyze their responses. Remember, the North Korean submarine is a hostile other. I think Bush put North Korea, am I right, in the axis of evil, along with Iran. And who else? Who was the third? Was it Iraq? So not a friend. So presented certainly in terms of US foreign policy as a hostile other. So, you know, you've got somebody who is now sort of in your life, is threatening you, is attacking you, and is not your friend. So identity may start to matter. Sinking a US Navy warship. So what are we talking about here when people are exposed to this? Does it feel like you yourself are being attacked as an American? Particularly if you have relatives in the Navy. And there's several million veterans, and there's tradition of militarism in many families where grandfathers, fathers, sons have served in the military. So do we have the self being attacked? Is the state, the US, the entire state being attacked? Is that what's being triggered? Is it going to trigger an in-group? You know, the rally around the flag, kind of. Let's forget about our internal differences because we have an external other who's threatening us. And is it about the US as a nation? Not as a state, but as a nation. So when you talk about a nation, you're talking about a shared national identity, okay? So it's a cultural, kind of patriotic. It's not just the state, as in government, okay? So here, what is our hypothesis? Well, the literature, as I said, is divided because Hurwitz in 1993 is saying, well, this should predict the use of force. But then Herman in 2009, more recently, is saying, it did predict force until I put in ethnocentrism. And then it went away and it predicted diplomacy. Patriotism predicted diplomacy once you put ethnocentrism in the model. Now, I have ethnocentrism in my model. So we'll see who is right. Hands up who thinks that the 1993 guy, Hurwitz, who says that patriotism predicts use of force. Hands up who thinks that he's right in this model. And hands up who thinks that Herman, the 2009 group, are right. One or two hands, maybe. Okay. And Can I ask you, why do you think that Herman might be right?
I think it probably based on like gender, like different groups, like ethnic groups and stuff like that. Or some people are more, what I'm trying to think of.
Yeah, so you're saying gender will make a difference. Ethnic groups.
Were like more diplomatic and stuff like that rather than more angry and forceful.
Right, so the doves could be in a majority in this sample. They could have an influence which could dampen that if they are proud of being American as well. Very good, yes. So this is what we're talking about. So because we have a mix of attitudes of different, on different levels in terms of domestic policy and foreign policy that run along gender lines, that perhaps run along age lines, that educational lines, we have to sort of put them all into the model and see what emerges as being important. Okay, so who wins out in terms of this? So here's the model and all the numbers. And I'm just, as I say, I'm going to concentrate on telling the story. As it turns out, in this model, patriotism is the most important predictor of your attitude. So this is something new for the literature. As I said, for about 40 years, they've been saying, don't look at identity. It doesn't matter how proud you are to be American. It doesn't matter who you are in that respect. It doesn't matter to attitudes to foreign policy. Well, in fact, we've put in foreign policy values, we've put in domestic foreign policy values, and we've put in all of our socio-demographics, and none of them matter as much as patriotism, how proud you feel to be American. And what way is this going in terms of the direction of the coefficient? It's minus. So how we interpret the coefficient is that the unit increase in patriotism. So for every 1 unit increase in this, what we call the independent variable. So in other words, you're going up the scale from 1 to 7. And remember, the lower the number, the more patriotic. So if you're going up 1 unit, you're becoming less patriotic. So 1 unit less patriotic predicts a minus, which is towards 1, which is opposing the use of force. So if you invert it, then the more patriotic you are, the more likely you are to be at 7, the use of force. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is what it means in terms of the numbers. I mean, I'm taking the coefficients as they're read. This beta on the right-hand side, this column here, that is kind of a standardization of the variables themselves, because, you know, we have 1 to 5 scales here, we've 1 to 6 scales, we've 1 to 7 scales, we've got categorical variables like race and gender. So what this beta line does, the column down here, is that it basically makes everything standardized. So you can measure how important things are according to the beta. So the higher the beta, the more important it is. And the beta for patriotism is 0.143. The next one, the next most important one is 0.130, and it's being African American or black. Because obviously you've got Jamaicans, you've got Haitians, you've got an awful lot of people who would categorize themselves as black who are not necessarily African Americans, although the majority would probably be African Americans. And what do you think this coefficient means? Do you think African Americans are more likely to use force or diplomacy? Hands up who thinks being black will lead you towards force. Anyone? No. Hands up who thinks being black will lead you towards diplomacy in this situation. Yeah, a few hands. Why do you think?
Just because it was a fully married birth, and that feeling was never left. And it definitely didn't leave until the end of the grow, and that was not very long ago.
Okay, so you're talking about the cultural history and the belongingness of African Americans or blacks to this notion of American, which was white from its inception. Okay, yes, very good. Any other? That's really a great point. Any others? Can I ask you? Yeah. Did you put up your hand? Oh, well then I shouldn't pick on you, I'm sorry. Did you put up your hand? Anyone else? Why do you think African American or being black leads you towards diplomacy? Maybe here. Yes?
Along the same lines as what he was saying, in one of the previous things, it showed that white people were the most patriotic and black were less patriotic.
Right.
So I think it would go along with how proud of the country you are and how likely you are to use force.
Right. So exactly what you're saying is what we showed earlier when we looked at the mean scores of patriotism, that the whites were at the top. They were the most patriotic. And the blacks were sort of a little bit lower down. So we can see that there's a difference there. And perhaps then this makes a difference. Did you want to say something? Yeah? Okay, so yes. Great. And actually, again, just like the point earlier, I think this is where I'm going with my theory. And I'm really glad you said that, because you're helping me, because that's what I think is going on. So in other words, you're saying that if you are black, that you will have had in your family history, or directly yourself, some notion of being oppressed, of having been removed from your home country to being brought to the US, the history of slavery, the oppression, the racism, the segregation, Jim Crow, and what that does to somebody's identity as to whether you really belong in America, whether you really are American or not. And that's possibly what's going on here. And the fact that you have experienced this oppression would lead you to actually want to solve things more diplomatically. Am I right in what you're saying? Yeah. And I think that's what the theory is. So being African American predicts the attitude opposing the use of force more significantly compared to whites. Remember, all of these racial categories are in comparison to whites. So what else matters? Well, we're getting into some more domestic policy issues here. So in terms of protecting the global environment over economic growth, you're going to oppose the use of force. So it's matching what's been going on in the previous models. So if you're, I suppose this could be conceived of as more liberal, perhaps, than conservative. And being female rather than male also predicts a move towards opposing the use of force. So again, we are getting the gender difference here. Women are less likely to use force, and that's what the literature has seen, and that's what previous models and previous surveys have shown. So support for the use of force, here's an interesting one. So the more educated you are in this scale here, so if you are educated to a 4-year postgraduate level, compared to those who are educated to high school or who didn't complete high school, you are more likely to support the use of force. So yeah, exactly. Normally, the literature has said the more educated you are, the less likely you are to use force. Now, in the first model, that was coming out a little bit, but that was a sort of a hypothetical, in an ideal situation kind of scenario. This is a scenario where the US has been attacked. And I then tried to figure out what's going on here. So I went back to my friend Hurwitz. He was right in terms of my model predicting patriotism. The more patriotic you are, the more likely you are to use force. So what did he say? What did he come up with? He found that levels of support for military action to drive Iraq out of Kuwait, so this is the first Gulf War, the early 1990s, were consistently highest amongst those with college experience. So they were more likely to say yes, send in the troops, get Iraq out of Kuwait. However, it did start to change during the war and changed again after the war. So it's interesting what's going on here in terms of education. Okay, so that's kind of the story really in terms of the hypothesis then. You know, does patriotism matter? Well, it came out number 1. So patriotism drives support for the use of force, which is evidence against Herman's findings, because I did control for ethnocentrism in the model. I'll go back to the model, you'll see it there, ethnocentrism. And it doesn't matter, the beta is nearly 0, and the coefficient is 0. So it's having absolutely no effect. So it's interesting that I seem to be contradicting what Herman et al. Found, but then they could have been using a different concept of ethnocentrism. So yes, we are in favor of Hurwitz. We are confirming his findings. And being African American against white predicts attitudes against the use of force, as well as being female versus being male. And ethnocentrism doesn't matter. Okay, so finally, this is just Irish public opinion. So I said I wanted to concentrate on the American aspects. after this part of the Irish experience, we can get more into sort of the issues of race and identity and look at that theory that you talked about and to see if there's any evidence for it. And it's kind of interesting. I looked at census data, I looked at rates of depression, I looked at violence within communities, and it divided up along racial lines. It was quite interesting. Anyway, so we have our Irish models here. And I mentioned what the scenarios were. So the first one is whether you want to retain or reject neutrality. So that's a foreign policy question. And it's really important. Most Irish people are very much in favor of retaining neutrality. And what predicts that attitude? Independence. The more you want Ireland to be independent, and the context is vis-a-vis the EU, or the European Union, the more likely you are to support neutrality. And remember, neutrality means being independent, so that makes sense. If your value is a predisposition towards independence, then it makes sense that you're going to support neutrality, because neutrality means independence. And patriotism comes up second. So again, like I remember when I was doing my thesis, and I was saying to my supervisor, I think there's something going on. I want to put in identity just to see if anything happens. And, you know, he thought I'd lost my marbles, as most people did. But, you know, it seems to matter. And we're coming up with our theories as to why. So I summarize it here in saying that patriotism matters most after protecting Ireland's independence, in predicting opinions about retaining neutrality, which is Ireland's foreign policy. So the more important your national identity, being Irish, is to you, the more you wish to want to retain neutrality. And that is followed by ethnocentrism to a degree, supporting Ireland whether she's right or wrong. That's an interesting one. It's the one just above independence there. So the coefficient is reasonably large. You can see at the beta, which standardizes things, it's not that large. It's only 0.07. And it's not as statistically significant. But it still matters. And that these findings more or less reflect past research results. For this, I'm kind of complaining myself. I think that the model is a very poor fit. So it means that, remember when I said to you, I used the question, not being proud of being Irish, but how important being Irish is to you. I ran other models where I used being proud to being Irish, and the fit was much better. But the problem was I couldn't include some domestic policy values in it because they weren't asked on the same half of the survey. So I complain about the fit of the model, but we can still get reasonable results from it. The second one is whether Ireland should integrate fully in the European Union. And that's quite a live issue. I don't know if any of you have been following what's been happening with Ireland. In 2008, as you know, in the US, Lehman Brothers collapsed. There was a financial crisis. Well, what happened in the EU was that there was a Eurozone crisis. The EU has its own currency, and not all of the 27 member states are in the currency. Ireland is in the currency. And we had a property bubble that collapsed. So banks were left, they had loaned out money, and they weren't going to get that money back. And the problem is that the German banks had given the Irish banks to lend out that money. So the Germans were very unhappy when they heard that the Irish banks weren't going to get their money back. And the ECB, European Central Bank, the European Commission, and some significant people within the German administration got together and decided that they were going to make the Irish people take on those debts. So they asked the Irish government to guarantee the Irish banks all of the debts and indeed all of the deposits. And we now own that debt. So it works out at about, I think it's 50,000 per person. So for every child born, they've more or less got a mortgage. And they've kind of kicked the can down the road in terms of paying it off. The interest rate is horrendous. It's like 4.85%. So that's about 4 billion a year. And the actual debt is 85 billion, and the actual guarantee is 400 billion. So if you think 4 million people into 400 billion, well, you can see that that math doesn't work, and we're never going to pay it off. This is part of the recolonization of Ireland that has taken place, and it's getting worse. I heard that the EU is now going to go and siphon off a percentage of people's savings in Cyprus. My dad told me that on the Skype the other day, so you know, it's all happening. And so it's kind of relevant when you ask Irish people, now this is dated. This happened well before the financial collapse, okay? This data was early 2000s. However, you know, values don't change. So what mattered in the second model was environment over economic growth, whether you want Ireland to unify with the EU or not. So obvious that that should matter. And then ethnocentrism, my country right or wrong. We should support Ireland even when she's wrong. And in fact, you know, we're told that we had to be right in taking on this debt. And it turns out that we were wrong, really, to take on this debt. But this is all post hoc. So patriotism isn't mattering here. So it is a foreign policy question, but it seems not to be touching on how proud you are to be Irish. Being Irish doesn't seem to matter here. It's coming down to attitudes in relation to businesses, regulation of businesses, environment versus economic growth. And that makes sense because Ireland conceives of, or people in Ireland conceive of the European Union as an economic entity. It does regulate business. It is about the free market. It was originally conceived of as an economic community with 4 freedoms: goods, people, services, and capital. That's what it was about. It started developing foreign policy and going in different directions now. But at this stage, at this time, when these people were asked these questions, the importance of these values makes sense. So it's about the preferred degree of European integration, whether you think Ireland should be supported even when she's wrong, and attitudes to business regulations. So control of business, and a desire to control business would predict an attitude towards less integration. So it fits with public perceptions of the state of EU affairs at this stage. So the final one is on Northern Ireland, which is still quite a live question. And the question is whether you think Ireland should be united into one state or whether it should be left in separate parts. So in other words, you know, people are talking about 2016 coming up. We had the 1916 Rising, which was significant in Irish history. And so, you know, some people in the 50s and 60s were predicting by 2016 there'll be a united Ireland. And there isn't one. So the development of Northern Ireland and Ireland is still an ongoing question. And interestingly, the most important predictor of your attitude concerned welfare. So we're getting into sort of fairness issues. In a way, Northern Ireland is about sort of social justice. It is about whether you want people to live as they live. Let them be unionists, let them be non-unionists, let them be whatever religion, whatever color, whatever persuasion they are. So it's strange, and yet if you think about it, it might make sense. And gender matters as well. Again, women are probably not only sort of less willing to use force, but perhaps are a little bit more accommodating to others. And maybe that's also touching here. So patriotism has no effect on attitudes to united Ireland. Being female, favouring more welfare spending, followed by support for Irish independence, also following Ireland's interests even when we're wrong, that ethnocentric aspect, all predict attitudes favouring Ireland being left as separate parts. Okay? No big drive for united Ireland here. If you are okay with inequality between groups, if you're okay with one group getting ahead more than another group, actually that predicts a desire for a united Ireland. So if you're okay with inequality, you want Northern Ireland. But if you're kind of more liberal, more accommodationist, you know, you're happy to spend money on welfare, you're happy to secure the welfare of other people, you're kind of egalitarian that way, you're willing to have, you know, Ireland left as separate parts. And what this is telling me is that this is a domestic policy wrapped issue. It's not, in a way, rising out of foreign policy issues. It's not rising identity issues either. Probably because most people born on the island of Ireland are considered Irish, whatever way Irish is to you. So that's the Irish models. Okay, So depending on how much time we have left, we could discuss this, take questions. Yeah, absolutely. I could get into sort of more the race stuff as well if you want to. But we've basically run through most of this in terms of Herman, I don't match up with him, and I do match up with Hurwitz. And I talked about further research. I want to understand what being proud of your identity means to you at a qualitative level. And that's really it. Okay, so I'll leave the racial stuff there. And if it comes up, then I'll bring up the data. Yeah.
Why did Ireland, or why did your government, what was the other option other than selling out to the European Union, the mortgage on everything?
It's a great question. I think that was part of the problem. We were told there was no other option. We were told there was no plan B. And this echoes what happens when we have referendums in Ireland. Because of our constitution, and we got our independence very late in the day. You guys got your independence from Britain a lot earlier than we did. Ours came much later. And so De Valera, who was basically our leader at the time, wrote this constitution, and he was very careful to say that the people of Ireland are the ultimate decision makers. And because of that, we have to have a referendum on every new treaty that comes along. The European Union decides it wants to take over more powers and to share power within the European Union, to pool sovereignty, as necessarily to take it away from states, but to pool it. And to do that, if you want to move into areas like transportation or environment or climate change or foreign policy, you have to write a treaty and make it law. And we as Irish people have to vote on these treaties. And it's the discourse. The discourse is the same. So we've had a referendum on the Single European Act in 1986. We had a referendum on the Maastricht Treaty around the early 90s. We had a referendum on the Amsterdam Treaty in 97, 98. We had a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. We had two referendums on the Nice Treaty in 2001 and 2002 because we voted no the first time and we were told that's not the right answer, so we voted yes the second time. And then in Lisbon, we had two referendums. We voted no in 2008, and in 2009, we were given the opportunity to get the answer right and to vote yes. So the government took it because it was told there was no other option. Interestingly, America is involved in this because Timothy Geithner, who was then US Secretary of State, Treasury, right? He was actually on the phone to our Minister for Finance saying, you better guarantee those banks.
It's the same relationship your country and other countries who disagree with the European Union. It's the same. I can see the same relationship with states like Michigan and our federal government, for example. Even our state, even our own state government. It's like I'm pretty sure our Senate's approval rating is like 1%. Our Congress is almost as worse. It's like one you're not representing.
Yeah. So, and also because I'm writing a paper on this actually, which was due last Friday, so editors are going to kill me. But it's looking at Irish foreign policy and sort of Irish neutrality and Irish peace policy, but it's looking at the decision maker and whether that decision maker was found to be corrupt. And I found that I looked at 5 different leaders at key points involved in European treaty decisions. So Sean Lemass, for example, up to Charles Haughey, Bertie Ahern. I even looked at Gareth Fitzgerald, whose nickname is Gareth the Great. And they were all either, let's just say, benefiting massively from political patronage. So, for example, Gareth Fitzgerald was forgiven a loan of €200,000 or pounds at the time by Allied Irish Bank, the bank that Irish people now own and that debt we now own. Now, this was back in 1993. 200,000 would have bought you 4 houses in Ireland. And that was just one loan that we knew he'd been forgiven of. Why did he have that loan? Because he bought shares in a company and then the company went bust. Well, if that happens to most people, you're left with it. But for him, he was forgiven the debt. And it's part of a network. So, I mean, I found correlations when I looked at it in terms of cases. And it is, the politics of that You know, I've talked about it in the media a lot. It's complicated, and there's a lot of interests involved. But basically, we were told we had to take it, and the European Union set it up so that it was very much last minute. It was very much, they tried, in fact, to get the Minister for Finance, who then passed away several months later. They tried to get him into a press conference to announce that Ireland was going to take this bailout. He said, no, I have to go back to Ireland. I have to ask my cabinet. I can't just announce this. You know, we have to follow the rules and procedures. We don't know anything about this, if this is good or bad. So they put the pressure on. Politics.
Question?
Yes.
Hi, you said you were looking at the data for all that stuff, and when you were looking at that, was there any data that really surprised you? I mean, seeing that the older you are, the more patriotic you are isn't really surprising to me anyway.
Yeah.
Was there anything when you were reading that really shocked you?
It's a good question. I suppose what puzzled me, and part of why I'm over here on a Fullbright, is that you can have a small state like Ireland, and the more patriotic you are, the less likely you want to, the less you want to use force, and that's your identity in the world. And yet you can belong to a big state like America, and the more patriotic you are, the more you want to use force. And for me, big state, small state, and those attitudes and the differences invested in being patriotic, that to me is, it's not shocking, but it's surprising. And yet it's not surprising, because obviously, you know, there's such a degree of difference between the capabilities of states and the politics of states and the history of states.
I would say our culture and media, especially like Hollywood, with all the action movies, you see cowboys running the battle.
Right.
Those type of things over decades kind of ingrained into us, this idea that we have to charge in the battle and all that comes out.
Right, so you say there's sort of a cultural environment where Hollywood films are promoting, in a way, the need to take action, to use violence if necessary, heroic. You know, it's conceived of as heroic, whereas the Irish history of sort of, you know, the 800 years of oppression or colonization, having experienced the level of violence that we did, and in fact there was a gentleman called Sean Lester who was head of the League of Nations before it was finally dissolved, and he had said, you need to understand why Ireland became neutral and was neutral, and it wasn't an issue of morality, because certainly the Holocaust had not been uncovered at that stage, and certainly, you know, the states that were involved in the Second World War were not there fighting for the Jews. They were there fighting for their interests, and so the Holocaust became a side issue in terms of how they got involved in the war in the first place. It then became part of the major issue. I'm losing my train of thought here, but what was I going to, I'm trying to get it back now. In terms of, oh yeah, Sean Lester, he said, you have to understand why Ireland was neutral, because what was done to the Jews was actually what was being done to the Irish people, only a few years, 16 years prior to the war. So we had a war of independence against Britain, and then we had a civil war amongst ourselves. But the Black and Tans and what they did to the Irish people, he said, was on par with what the Nazis were doing to the Jews. So we were neutral, and we were actually neutral on the side of Britain to a small degree. We never actually let it impinge on our neutrality, although part of the discourse trying to, in a way, get people, Irish people, to sort of reject neutrality and join a military alliance and be part of the European Union in that respect, the pressure is there to delegitimize neutrality and to sort of revise that history. And a lot of my research is about sort of combating that by actually looking at what was said and what was done and looking at it empirically. But other than that, no major surprises, I don't think. I've probably been looking at it too long. Do you have any major surprises? Tell me, what are your surprises? Anybody? Yes?
Well, in the Irish guy, I was a little surprised to find people who were more likely to support social services and things like this would not want to take the 6 counties on. Everyone I talked to, well, not everyone, but a lot of people my age who I spoke with when I was there, you know, part of the 26 counties, if they had any opposition to doing it, you know, if they were, well, we're proud to be Irish, we'd love to be united, you know, just for the sake of doing it, but the debt we would incur, all the health services and everything else that the British are paying for, they didn't want to take that on. It sounded like to me, people my age anyhow.
Got you.
East Germany, West Germany. Yeah.
Yes. East
Right.
Germany, West Germany comparison. Yes. So
my assumption was
Yes.
the opposite. I think of what I understood was that, in
Yes.
fact, people who are willing to take that debt or that,
Yeah.
take on those services were less likely to accept.
yeah, so people who were more willing to spend money on welfare, i.e. help those who are less fortunate, in a way making a we out of everybody rather than an us and a them. So you're the poor people, you're not really part of us. So they have a more cosmopolitan, open understanding, perhaps, a more sharing basis towards others. So in a way, if you have a more sharing, more open, more understanding, more accommodating, more generous attitude towards others, in a way you can say live and let live. If you want to be separate and it's important to you to be Protestant and Unionist and to do your marches and to have, all of those parts of that cultural identity and you want the separate state, go ahead. So it depends. But your point is absolutely right. A lot of people have said it's going to cost too much. It used to oscillate actually, and like the Unionists would say, no, it cost us too much to be part of Ireland. And then it was like the Irish in Ireland saying, oh, it costs too much to take on Northern Ireland. And you're right, that's always been part of it. So it is an interesting one. It is. Yes, Roger.
It was interesting. We were in Ireland during that the campaign for the first Lisbon.
Oh, 2008. Yes.
It was interesting that Sinn Féin, which is large in the north and an emerging, as it were, party in the Republic, they were very much against the Lisbon, and I think they were the cause of it being defeated the first time around.
Yes.
And yet, ironically enough, they also are a major driving force in the north for change amid this peace. And if you listen to them, they talk in terms of social welfare as well as 32 counties.
Yes.
Which is, kind of ironic. So here's a
Yes.
political party which is trying to amalgamate a number of divergent
Yes.
directions.
Yes.
It's interesting. I was also going to ask, as far as America, and I see Denny Gillum sleeping over there. Wake up now, Denny, you're going to help me on this. He's the military man.
Yes.
West Pointer.
Yes.
Now, between the Civil War and Vietnam, I don't think there was an awfully large combat integration of African Americans into the combat troops. There was none.
I think
yes.
the Korean War, after the Korean War, was when blacks were actually officially fighting alongside whites. Is right? Is that?
Yes. The integration took place right after.
Yeah. But certainly with Vietnam, it really took off.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if, and it's certainly been growing along with Mexican Americans
Yes.
In fighting roles. So it'd be interesting to see if that ultimately will change the attitude towards patriotism, because large numbers of illegals, that is the way of getting into
Yes.
U.S. citizenship, if you're willing to put your time into the U.S. Army.
Right.
And as of late, women.
Yes. Women are now legally allowed to fire weapons, take part in active combat.
And
Yes.
there is talk
Right.
in certain Republican circles of women having to enlist for the draft
Okay.
here in the United
Yes.
States.
Heard that.
So that could really throw,
Yeah.
an interesting
Yes.
a whole new facet onto your studies, which were brilliant.
So in a way, we've got two different dimensions. So joining the military is a way to belong. If your concept of patriotism and the dominant concept of patriotism is in fact a military patriotism. Also, there's benefits to it because you can get your education paid. So if you come to the country and you're coming because you didn't have anything in the country you came from to support you, you had no resources, you had no money, you had no job, and you come to America, you're looking for a better life, you're looking to work, you're looking to give your kids an education that you didn't get. And George Bush II actually was interesting because he changed the Patriot Act, or he changed the bill, the GI Bill, that did allow you to have, correct me if I'm wrong, did allow you to get your education paid for after a certain number of military years in military service, but he allowed you to donate it to your children. So as an immigrant coming in, the fact that you can get your education for your children, well, you know, if you're willing to die for your children, which most parents are, you'd be willing to try to, you know, enlist and fight if necessary in order to get your children education, to get that start. So it's interesting. I do have, I don't know if we have time now. We're kind of out of time. Do we have wiggle room? A couple of minutes. I'll just show you this very briefly. And I'm going to basically, these are the theories that I'm trying to knit together, okay? I'm not going to go into it. Theories of violence, personality and political psychology, colonialism and the psychological analysis of oppression. So that's the links between Native Americans, blacks, and Irish. We've all been colonized. We've all been slaves. And we all share the same attitude to the use of force. We go for diplomacy. Racial identity, having a less than identity. So if you suffer from structural inopportunity, and that happens to these ethnic groups, then it will give you a less than identity, and that has severe problems. And we'll see it in terms of behavioral analysis. So I look at foreign policy, I look at right-wing authoritarianism in relation to violence, I look at social identity theory, and number 7, developmental and shock trauma. So it comes from people serving in the military, PTSD, 1 in 3 returning soldiers has PTSD, through to domestic violence. So not only do I want to understand meanings of national identity, but because race matters, and here's what I was looking at. I looked at census baselines. So in 1990, there's 30 million blacks, so 12% of the US population. 1/2 live in the South, and that hasn't changed much. 30% of black people were poor compared to 10% of white in 1989. So you're nearly 3 times as likely to be living in poverty. 1990s, 2 million Native Americans, the first Americans, and 30% of them were living below the poverty line compared to the national average, not just whites, but national average, and 51% of reservation-based Native Americans are living below the poverty line. So you can see that these groups, there is structural inopportunity there, shall we say. How does that relate to violence? Because I wanted to look at the effects of violence on the individual within a community and whether that affects their attitude to foreign policy and violence to others in that respect. And what I wanted to see was, and this compares with Ireland. Ireland has one of the worst figures for murder rates of wives, for wife battering, for domestic violence, for child abuse, for rape. It's as bad. In terms of the US stuff, 1 in 3 women will be victims of coercion. Men are also victims as well, but not to the same extent as women. There was a survey of in all 50 states, 4 women would be raped or physically assaulted by a current or former spouse, a cohabiting partner, a dating partner at some stage in their life. 2 to 4 million women of all ages, races, and classes experience violence within relationships, but this is where it comes in. There's an ethnic differentiation. So it's common, but look at how it differs amongst racial groups and how it's also linked to poverty. Because if you're on benefits, you're more likely to experience this kind of violence. And 50 to 60% of women receiving public benefits have experienced physical abuse, compared to 22% of the population. So you're 3 times more likely. Some studies said it was 82%. You're 4 times more likely. PTSD, behavioral effects, depression. So over half of women who experience partner violence are diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder, and half of those experience PTSD. Okay, so this will affect your ability to trust, and it will affect your attitude as to whether, when the US is attacked, what your response is going to be. Substance abuse is also there as well. I'm sorry now to just end with this like story of misery, but it does actually impact. It's part of this theory that I'm going with. So you have emotional distress accompanying PTSD, you have depression, and a history of depression is linked to your risk of being a victim. So I thought, let's look at depression rates. Whoa. Well, okay, well, we'll a couple of minutes quickly on the differentiation between violence. Amongst black females, You are more likely to experience domestic violence than if you are a white woman, and you are more likely to suffer rates of deadly violence from family members. So you know that gun violence is particularly high. Even Barack Obama said that the black community experience gun violence, deadly lethal violence, more often than any other community. Native American are twice as likely to suffer stalking, which kind of perhaps relates to the reservation context, 3 times more than African American and 4 times more than Asian women. And they experience double the rate of rape or sexual assault than any other groups. So we talked about how Native Americans and African Americans or blacks have different attitudes to foreign policy and have a history of oppression. Well, they also experience currently significant levels of violence, which I think is linked to that oppression because it's intergenerational, which is my next part. Intergenerational effects. So if you are a child and you are exposed to this, you're going to have problems later on as well. So physical aggression occurs in 1 in 3 teen dating relationships. 1 in 5 female high school students report being physically or sexually abused by a dating partner, and child abuse is significantly correlated with domestic violence. So in other words, take an example, and again, as I say, women also batter men, but if a man is battering a woman and the children see this, this has effects on them. Physically or sexually abused girls are more likely to drink, smoke, use illegal drugs, 3 times more likely to binge and purge, and all of this is related to depression, which I'm getting to. 83% of Hispanic Texans agree that a husband who abuses his wife is more likely to abuse his children, but only 47% think that domestic violence passes from generation to generation. And it does. So between 3 and 10 million children witness domestic violence, and the research shows that violence can have a serious negative effect on development. So that's where number 7, the developmental and shock trauma, comes in. I'm going to have to end now shortly. There was a Michigan study actually done. Again, if you have low income and you've been exposed to violence, you're going to have higher rates of illness and PTSD. And then finally, and this is my last slide, and this is depression, okay? So this is where this is all leading. Because of all of what's going on, look at this in terms of race. So prevalence of depression, and this is 2 different studies. If you're white, any depression is 8% over there on the right-hand side column. Okay, if you're black, it's 13%. And it's just statistically significant. If you're Hispanic, it's still higher than white. And if you're other non-Hispanic, it's still higher. So there you can see what's going on. And that will have an effect on your attitudes to violence in terms of foreign policy as well. So it's complex. And I'll end there. There was one last thing I wanted to say. Oh, here it is. The last point there. Interesting. Only in an atmosphere of restored self-confidence and mutual generosity is it likely that our society will be prepared to do those things for its poor and racial minorities, which it should have done a long time ago, which, but for the war, it might well be doing right now. I think I already gave away the answer, but does anyone know what American political elite said that? Any guesses? Throw out some names. I beg your pardon? The woman senator for San Francisco. Okay, yeah, so quite recent. Good. Any other names? Who else would have said this, do you think? Johnson? Okay. Any others? Lincoln. You're going far back. Well, I'll tell you, it was Senator William Fullbright. And he's the guy who caused me to be here. And that's finally it. That is the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Devine.
Sorry.